Okay, hi. I'm the second Leon in Petra's lab. Hello, welcome from my side as well. I'm a PhD student at the brain simulation section at Charité in Berlin, and I'm going to talk you through an approach we developed during the last years about integrating biological knowledge into brain simulation. And I have a message in front of my screen. Now it's gone. Okay, so the topic of today is integrating biological knowledge into brain network models, into brain simulation, as we do it with the virtual brain. Our content for today, we're starting from the scratch actually. So I try to keep it short. So since my background is also a bit of philosophy, I couldn't resist to start from the beginning to talk about epistemology, what is knowledge and how we can know. So just basic thoughts about before we integrate it into a simulation, a brain simulation, we have to know what knowledge is. So we cover this at the beginning. Then we talk about the representation of knowledge and the access of knowledge in a computational sense. So how to use the knowledge we gain about the brain, about the dynamics of the brain, about brain changes and diseases, how we could represent this in a way we can integrate this then in a computational framework for simulations. So it's going to be about the semantic web, technologies, computational ontologies, and knowledge management. And then in the third part, we talk about integrating this knowledge then into brain modeling and integrating those representation systems as well. So why at all talking about knowledge and this basic factor of biological pathways and in the context of brain simulation? Because there is already a plethora of published biomedical information out there. So we have millions of scientific articles. I think it's 40 million articles in PubMed already. So there are at least 2 million results for the search term brain and 200,000 results for Alzheimer's disease, for example, for a specific phenomenon of brain dynamics that can be related to a change in brain dynamics, for example. So we have to ask the question, what knowledge is out there of the concepts of interest, how we can access and exploit it, and how we can use this knowledge then to build biologically plausible dynamical models of the brain. We have this framework, you've seen this in the first talk. So we have multiple dimensions to span our models in. So we have the time dimension, we have the space dimension, we have also different modalities of brains. So we have different forms of abstraction that capture the activity of single neurons, because most of the time we're using imaging data for human brain data. So this is also a level of abstraction that lays behind. So there's always a theory and methodology behind brain data. And also this is then translated into a model. And therefore, it's a huge framework that is multidimensional with a variety of data sources, heterogeneous brain data, different spatial scales, different data types and coordinate spaces, and different disciplines that specifically focus on one aspect of those data types. Because there's a whole field of research only developing specific and particular methods in functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example. And we're using this modality to inform our models. Therefore, we also need knowledge about how this is created and on what theory this is based on. And we have a huge amount of the existing biomedical information about molecular pathways, about gene and protein cascades, about protein-protein interaction networks that lead to a specific change of brain structure, but also of brain function. For example, that lead to a change in cortical thinning in Alzheimer's disease, or in a psychological mental disorder, for example, there's also brain changes in function and structure. And if we want to integrate this knowledge and bridge mathematics that we have formulate to build a model of brain dynamics and the biological domain that gives us information about the cascades leading to a certain phenomenon. So this is all summarized with a broad term of knowledge. And the question is, what is knowledge and what are the foundations of knowledge? So we have different fields in philosophy that try to tackle specific questions. And we can also relate this then to a scientific theory and to a scientific methodology. So the question is, first on the most foundational level, so what is reality? So what are the components of the brain, basically? And how we can approximate this reality is through epistemology. So how can we gain knowledge about the reality? Because obviously we cannot watch neurons fire when we look at someone else, so we don't see the activity. We can't. It's super small, so we at least need a microscope. And this is also just an abstraction. We cannot see everything at once. Therefore, we need some methods of knowledge acquiring knowledge, so of gaining knowledge, and this can be thought of with methodology. And we need also, of course, some data sources. So what data can we collect? How does the data look like? From which physical properties the data is derived from? So this is all like interchanged and also dependent on each other. But basically what we always want to know is what the reality is like. And this is basically how the ontology of things is structured. So just to talk about how to gain this knowledge, so it's epistemology, the philosophy field, and it's based on the reason of knowledge, so the understanding or the account of knowledge. And it goes back to Plato. So the question was here, what is to know? So how is knowledge good? Then John Locke raised the questions, what are the operations of human understanding? So more in a philosophy of science sense. Then we have Kant. So what are the preconditions of the possibility of human understanding? And then there's Bertrand Russell. How can modern science be justified by the appeal of sensory experience? So it's more about empirical methods to gain knowledge. And how can we define this? Because this is always the question. So what is actually knowledge? It could be said that it's kind of a quality of cognitive success. So knowledge could be one of the many kinds of cognitive success we could be interested in understanding. So it could be derived from the Latin word cognitio or scientia as well. So we have different definitions of knowledge. It could be the understanding of information about a subject, either known by one person or by people generally. We could use the Wikipedia definition, for example. The knowledge is a familiarity or awareness of someone or something, such as facts, skills, or objects, often contributing to understanding. Or we go with Plato that says it's the true belief accompanied by a rational account. And we can also see that this is a kind of a view of the world that is somehow justified. So we have a feeling, a belief, and we have something more that justifies our belief. And we see that this is about knowing that. So there are different kinds of knowledge. So we have procedural knowledge, for example, knowing how to ride a bike or how to use the fMRI scanner. We have knowledge by acquaintance. So I was in I know the feeling of how when I eat the chocolate. Sorry, I know the taste of chocolate. So I know my neighbor because I acquainted him. So we passed by and I've seen him. Then there's phenomenal knowledge. So I know what it's like to taste Pizza Hawaii, for example, or I know what it's like to taste chocolates, which has a qualitative difference to the knowledge by acquaintance, because it's attached to emotions. I know the taste that is differentiated by the feeling, and we know how we know that. So propositional knowledge, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So it's that what we also defined beforehand. It's kind of a scientific knowledge. So I know that X is P, and we try to talk about when we can say I know that X. So the conditions about knowledge, and we see that it's not as easy to define the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, because there's always some tricky things and so to notice. But we start from the beginning, from Plato's definition of knowledge. So something knows that P, if and only if P is true, because if a notion of the world was false, then you wouldn't consider it to be knowledge, right? So if I would say the earth is flat, and this is not knowledge because it's not true, I would say. So it's just a belief. And so truth is a metaphysical notion. So it is, there is no right or wrong. There is only one condition. And we need a belief also. So if something is metaphysically true, but we haven't thought of it, then it's not knowledge, because the truth condition can be without a belief. So there are so many undiscovered things that are true and that are existent, but we don't know that they exist because we haven't thought about it. So we need a belief condition as well. And we need a kind of a justification in believing of a certain notion. So this can be summarized as the theory of justified true belief. So those are the three conditions that make up knowledge. But there could be justified true belief without knowledge. So basically, it's just luck that every conditions were met. And this was formulated by Edmund Gettier. And it's just an example of thinking about knowledge, and an example of the trajectories of epistemology. And we're not going into detail of each things, but this is a complete new lecture and a complete field of philosophy. But I think it's also interesting to talk about those things in short. But so the objection to this justified true belief notion was that there could be someone walking up the street, and you look across a field and you see a sheep. Then you go nearer, and you realize that the figure you've seen before was just a rock in the shape of a sheep. So your belief was justified because the shape resembles the sheep, but not true. But when now a sheep stays behind the rock, then your initial sentence, there's a sheep in the field, was also true. But this was just luck, because you didn't see the sheep, you just saw the rock. So it was not really knowledge. So because it was not, you have not met all the intuitive conditions, I would say, because it was just luck. And therefore, you can have justified true belief without having knowledge, basically. So that's it from my old days. There is also a modern approach of this, and this approach of virtue epistemology was also developed by Linda Zagzebski, and it's redefining knowledge as not explainable by justified true belief and all the other streams that added conditions to the initial three conditions. So there are different streams of appending the justified true belief hypothesis. So it's in parallel to a moral virtue. So knowledge is a belief that is arising from the acts of an intellectual virtue. So it emphasizes basically the role of those virtues in knowledge acquisitions. And it adds a layer of ethical and intellectual intellectual qualities into the scientific process. So it kind of recognizes that the quality of the scientific knowledge is not just based on the methodology, but also of the virtues that are exercised by the scientists involved. So a belief counts as knowledge if the results if the beliefs are kind of based on a reliable cognitive process, and this cognitive process is then kind of manifested by the agent's intellectual virtues. So with that, we can circumvent this Gettier problem because we shift the focus from the properties of the belief to the properties of the agents, basically, that holds the belief. And so we can say if the belief is formed through an intellectual virtue, through exercise, then the role of luck is minimized or even eliminated. Because in a deterministic sense, there is no luck about gaining knowledge because it's based on the agent's properties. So there are virtues like open-mindedness, intellectual courage, rationality, intellectual humility, and also like motivation as well, that are essential for gaining knowledge. And therefore the justification condition entails the truth condition. And this circumvents several objections and includes also a social aspect of the gain of knowledge and of the process of acquiring knowledge. And yeah, so there's also bell hooks, who's pretty popular at the moment, which also emphasizes the role of personal and the societal context of shaping knowledge and understandings. So it's also about the individual experiences and the characteristics of a single individual in the belief formation and in the gain of knowledge. And it explores also the societal and economic aspects of class, gender, and race that are preconditions basically for certain acquisitions processes of knowledge. And this idea also goes way back. So it's a modern approach, but also in more Arabic philosophy. So for example, Abu Nasir al-Farabi, who was also back then telling that the acquisition of knowledge also is based on the intellectual virtues and the rationalities in the process. And therefore, it's a different way of thinking about how to gain knowledge and what knowledge conditions are. But this is pretty abstract, and if we have time, we can discuss this afterwards. So I will jump over because we already took some time about talking about this, and we have always to relate it then back basically to the topic of interest today, the biological knowledge. So we can say that biological knowledge is basically a matter of accepting a true biological hypothesis on the basis of strong evidence. So the truth condition, or if we go with the traditional approach, we need a true biological process that is justified by strong evidence for our theory, for our belief. And this evidence is then the best explanation for various biological phenomena. We can also go into the virtue epistemology for gaining this, and I will not really go into detail, but we can also apply the notion of rationality that has been set in this virtual epistemology aspect for the scientific method, for the empirical method, for example, as well. And we also have to state that the biological knowledge we gain today is also not isolated from societal and systemic issues. So we always have to consider the historical context of a scientific research process, for especially if it in or excludes marginalized groups. And there's also a huge influence on class and health and disease, which in recent research is included. But if we talk about the general biomedical knowledge we already have, we have to take those historical factors also into account, which goes along with the epistemology from Bell Hooks, for example. So the open questions of how to gain biological knowledge is, how close do we have to get to an explanation in order to become true? So in our scientific method is always an approximation of truth. And the question is, how close do we have to come to say that this is true? So open question. What is the relationship between biological knowledge and the understanding of it? And can we also truly appreciate the truth conditions or the mere truth, the metaphysics in biology, with only theoretical knowledge? Or do we need to know how to use different various biological models? So those are questions we not really go into in the next, but I found it quite interesting to think about this. So how can we systematize that in this knowledge? We can do this classically, as they've done like way back with the classification and taxonomy of biological species, for example. We can create databases and repositories for biological data. We have already created a huge amount of theoretical frameworks that resulted in a mass of review articles and meta-analysis that use the databases and repositories to create new theoretical frameworks. Then there are thousands of educational curricula that also systematize the biological knowledge, that try to summarize a specific domain, for example, in a lecture series about virtual brain. Then there are ontologies, which we go into more detail later, and there are different research standards and scientific protocols that also try to systematize the knowledge and try to link concepts and different methods together. So now we have had a quick overview about the epistemology, about what knowledge is and how to systematize biological knowledge. And now we go one step further to speak about how to systematize this biological knowledge computation, how we can represent everything we know about certain biomedical concepts in a machine-readable fashion that is integrated in the World Wide Web. And this goes back, or the idea of this is called the semantic web, and goes back to the founder of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. And he described this in an article in the Scientific American in 2001. And oh, sorry. And yeah, the idea is basically that the main feature of the World Wide Web should be universality. So it should be the essential property. And universality means that anything must be able to link to anything. So we must think about how we put data on the web that can be interlinked. So we have information that varies along many axes, and we now have to think about how we can define the data we put on the web with meaning to exchange it and to interlink it with other data points that have similar meaning. And therefore, we have to add a semantic layer and a layer of information to the data that is not only for human consumption. For example, yeah, the example in the article was poetry, or just primarily for machines in binary code, like in databases. We need a human and machine readable representation and descriptive framework for the data to be interlinked and universal. And this can be seen as a new way to produce and share also scientific knowledge. And companies like Google already have implemented the semantic web in their search engine. And when companies can do this, why can we as scientists not only make use of this concept? And I think in the era of big data and the World Wide Web at this peak, we need to think about how to access and link different data sets and different data points in the most fair fashion. And we come to this also later. So the four columns of the semantic web is basically the expression of meaning. So it's an encoding of the semantics. It's an encoding of a web page, and it's a further development from the Web 2.0, where you have XML definitions and interlinked web pages. We have now a web page that is also semantically encoded and linked to concepts, and not only to other data points. The data points are linked to the concepts describing the semantics of the data. So it's expressing the meaning of what the data is about. Then we have the knowledge representations. So we need access to the information and also access to a set of logical rules for reasoning. So we need we have now the concepts defined with meaning, the data points defined with meaning, but we also have to give a set of logical axioms to say what can be done with certain data points that have a specific meaning. And the key feature of the knowledge representation system is here that this is not centralized. So we have a unified language to express data and rules. This is also one aspect of the Web 3.0. So and the further development with tools like blockchain and those technologies, where you have an uncentralized system and graph-based representation system of a certain entity. And in order to be linked to anything, we need also a universal resource identifier, because we don't have a central resource where everything is stored. It's distributed, And therefore, each entity needs a universal resource identifier to know where exactly the data lies. And this, yeah, you know this for web pages with the universal resource language, resource location, URL. We need a URL to know where the data page we want to access is, where the web page we want to access is. And yes, this knowledge representation is based on extensible markup language and the resource description framework. So we have the extensible markup language that is basically the syntax which structures documents. And we have the resource description framework, which encodes the meaning, so the semantics with a specific syntax. And we also already talked about ontologies in the philosophical sense. We also have computational ontologies that define a concept and all the classes and links the identifiers from different databases. And now we can assign also properties to classes on which our inferences are then based. And we can also have a hierarchical representation with several subclasses that can inherit properties of their superclasses. And we have certain agents acting upon also the entities. We have different software tools that process the content from different sources, that exchange the results with other programs. And by that, we can gain a shared understanding of a certain domain by exchanging those ontologies. And with that, we have an uncentralized definition framework. So a nomological network, basically, without the need of standardization and without the need of a central resource. And we know, everybody knows that standardizing is good, but for some aspects, there's always exceptions. And for some applications, there are always exceptions that don't fit certain approaches of standardization. And with this uncentralized definition framework, we can include those exceptions and link them to the standards. And therefore, we have also a flexible way of defining things. So we have the hierarchy of basically, on the low level, there's data, then there's information, and if we draw inference of data and information, we gain knowledge. So data can be seen as like a string of bits or numbers or symbols. And the semantic data then entails the information that is then meaningful. So meaningful to us humans and also meaningful to computers and machines. And like traditional information systems are lacking of those semantic affiliations or semantic associations because they process the data basically without analyzing the knowledge behind. And this is depicted here on the right panel. So we could have like a neural network that analyzes the image from a set of pixels, and we can differentiate certain aspects of the image because this is purely data-based. But still, the algorithm doesn't know what the parts represent in the image. And therefore, we need to link the bits, the data points of each pixel to the concept of the class tree, basically. And then we know that the blue points here that are differentiated from the image of a tree relate to the branches, and the gray points to the trunk, and the green ones to the leaves, for example. So how to teach this? So how can we represent this in a computational fashion? This is also known as knowledge engineering, and it's basically the process of to systematize the knowledge that is stored in millions of those articles, millions of scientific articles and databases, to extract the meaning of different concepts and this is called semantics. And then we have to define this and connect them into a really well formulated structure. So the question is how to define different semantic concepts and how to interlink them. And this has been done in many different applications in neuroscience. And yeah, so we can say that those semantic web technologies facilitate the representation and linking of data in a machine-readable format. And there are several of different approaches already that use the semantic web and Web 3.0 technologies, mostly defined also with the World Wide Web Consortium, to make use of those technologies for using it for neuroscientific research. There's a lot more actually. And yeah, we will go over a few, but not all. So at first, we need controlled vocabularies, which is an organized arrangement of words and phrases that are used to index content and also to retrieve content. So we need some common search terms basically to access data. And those controlled vocabularies typically include preferred terms. So the most used one, for example, in the most used nomenclature, and variant terms or synonyms that could be used equivalently to point to the same concept. And by using controlled vocabularies, two researchers could use two different languages or two different nomenclatures talking about the same concepts. And adding this controlled vocabulary, we know that both researchers are talking about the same topic, basically about the same concept. Otherwise, we wouldn't know. And so we could now then analyze mere text and extract the controlled vocabularies, the controlled terms for the set of string, for the string data, which is unstructured. And with adding this, we have a semantic metadata layer to extract what the text is about. So we now know this is about renal insufficiency and humbramycin, and this provides then information to catalog the string or the data in a specific way and links the data to its meaning. So vocabulary also, in a controlled fashion, increases the sensitivity and specificity of concept searches. Because if we want to search all publications about Alzheimer's disease, for example, we would need to search for Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's dementia, which are all terms used but for the same concept. And using a controlled vocabulary, like in the medical subject headings ontology, we can use one preferred term and one unique resource identifier that links to all the used terms for one concept. And this increases also the sensitivity. But we now have a list of concepts and their synonyms, basically. And this is already better than just reading the text. But the problem is it doesn't reflect the state of being. And this can be done with already, I showed you already this 2 times with ontologies. And it's based on the word being, and the science logia. So ontologia, basically the science of being or the study of being, with the question, so what is the nature of existence? What is a human? Or, for example, what are physical parts? Are those physical parts more real than immaterial concepts, like thoughts, for example? Those are questions for philosophical ontology. But we will focus here more on, in a narrow sense, on computational ontologies that try to describe what exists in a particular domain. So a computational ontology is a representation of shared, agreed, and detailed model or sets of concepts of a certain problem or domain. So we have a data model of a certain knowledge domain, which describes all components and features as well as their relationship. So it's a systematized formalization of knowledge in computational sense, in which is human and machine readable. So the computer points to the concept as the brain points to a concept. When you hear Alzheimer, you have immediately the association to the Alzheimer's dementia. And this is what we try to teach computers as well. How can this be done? This is basic. It's pretty basic, but also genius, because we can represent knowledge with different entities in a graph-based fashion with a simple subject, predicate, object syntax. So we have basically triplets of two nodes and one edge describing the relationship between two nodes. And this can be then arbitrarily increased in complexity. So the resource description framework is a metadata layer to the data, as it in the original sense was designed as a metadata model to describe information in the web. But we can also use it as a general method for describing data in a graph-based fashion. And RDF is the basis for more complex languages, for example, the web ontology language OWL or SCOS. But basically, it's all about representing knowledge inside a graph. So this is a more complex one, for example. So we have a simple knowledge of a family constellation, basically, in which like a father is somehow in a relationship to a mother, which gave birth to a child with all three are persons. So this is a bit more complex, but we can of course do it even more complex. So the difference between an ontology in a computational sense and a taxonomy is that an ontology has a higher level of complexity and dimensionality. It has also information about different relationships, and the relationship can depend on certain contexts. So we have different rules and axioms we can define inside an ontology. We can have disjoint classes. So if A, then not B, for example. And we have a certain understanding of the metadata on the organization. In the taxonomy, on the other hand, we have only hierarchical relationships. So A is a subclass of B, and we have only those then one dimension, and we cannot represent the relationships across different domains. If you want to hear more about ontologies, then I can link you to this video from another fall school. There, Konstantin goes into detail about that. So, I can't see the chat, but if any questions are already in the chat, then we could do this now. Otherwise, we can then just proceed. How do I see the chat? Don't know. I'll proceed. So it's about ontologies in neuroscience, or ontologies built for the neuroscientific research, basically. And it's about the understanding of brain organization, which spans across multiple spatial scales. And we have, as I already showed you in the first slide, the heterogeneity of data produced within each domain that basically link to the same concept, but in a different spatial scale. And with the use of ontologies, we can bridge the data resources and spatial scales, and we can unify concepts without the need for heavy standardization across different research fields, because we know that each research field has its own way of conducting research and talking about research, and it's difficult to say a group to a group of researchers, you now have to switch to a new standard, which in within a domain is super helpful, like for the brain imaging data structure or something like that, the BIDS. But between research fields and between domains, it becomes more an hassle, I would say. So we can circumvent this by unifying without centralization. And this can be done, for example, with brain anatomy. So we have the Uberon, the Uber ontology, which is a really well-defined ontology. And now we also have the medical subject headings ontology, which is like the Uberon ontology, an ontology for rather broader medical subject headings, so that everything that has been used as a heading for scientific publication in PubMed, for example, has been then incorporated in this ontology of biomedical concepts of MASH. And you can see here that, for example, we have here Alzheimer's disease. I was talking about that. And the unique identifier. So we have a unique resource identifier. So we know that this concept is accessible via this link. Then we have a description, a semantic description. And then we have the definition of all entry terms. So all synonyms that relate basically to the same concept. But you see, there are different ways of talking about the same stuff. And it's also linked to different other concepts, like, for example, the amyloid beta peptide, which has associated with Alzheimer's disease. And we have also a multidimensional tree structure, basically, that shows also the superclasses. So we see that this is a difference to taxonomies, because we have Alzheimer's disease listed as dementia, as tauopathy, and also as a neurocognitive disorder. So we have one concept that could be part of different superclasses, as it is in real world as well. So we have different angles of description, and we can go from different scales towards one concept, and using different language and nomenclature. And if we use this medical subject headings, for example, we can specify our search and unify our way of understanding and way of communication about things, and way of knowledge also. And you probably all have used medical subject headings before, knowingly or not knowingly. So if you type in a search term into PubMed and try to find out some literature, you will, under the hood, PubMed will also search for the terms associated with the one you typed in, using the medical subject headings ontology. Then there's a rather taxonomical definition of gene names. So there's the Hugo gene nomenclature, so the Hugo gene H-gene-C. It's one of those spiraling acronyms. And there, all the protein expressing genes and of the human and different other species are listed. And if you are working rather in the domain of bioinformatics, then you probably have also come across the Hugo gene nomenclature, which is also in its sense an ontology, because we have different unique resource identifiers, and we have a interlinked set of terminology and terms. And yeah, most of the journals, I think, also want you to use the gene nomenclature, because then we know that we're talking about the same concept. And yes, this is a bit confusing, because there's also the gene ontology, which is not about the gene nomenclature, but rather about the processes different genes and proteins that are expressed by the genes are involved with. And it's rather a gene function ontology, and or basic ontology of biological processes. And this is, I think, the most prominent one, and it has like over 40K classes of gene functions and 134K relationships to each other. And yeah, you will come across this. And you can even use the gene ontology to enrich a set of genes that you found out in your study with the processes that certain genes are associated with. And then you get an information about how the most probable molecular cascade or biological process in general is associated with your set of high-risk genes for a certain disease, for example. To shorten this up, we can use, for example, the bioportal that hosts like over 1,000 ontologies. We can use the ontology lookup service, which also has hundreds of biomedical ontologies. And both systems also try to interlink the classes of each ontology. Because, for example, in the, let's say, the Alzheimer's disease ontology that lists all concepts that are related to Alzheimer's disease, for example, has the brain area hippocampus listed because it's an important concept in Alzheimer's disease. And now we can cross-reference it to the Uberon ontology because we know that this is the same concept because it has the same unique resource identifier. So we can have the same concept in different applications that link all to the same resource in the end. And with that, we can have a descriptive metadata system. So we have an information scheme about the data that link the data points to their meaning and to the concepts. So we have an increased findability of data structures, because if we're interested in a data set about Alzheimer's disease, and it weirdly is described with a super uncommon nomenclature, for example, then we don't find it. If we use mesh term, for example, then we will also find this data set. So the data needs to be interoperable. So we need to have a central integration system, and basically Web 3.0 facilitates the integration of different data sources and the interoperability between different applications, because we have always this semantic layer that is using simple RDF structures that can be then interpreted by most languages and most software tools, because it's basic in XML. And we can reuse the data because it's well described. So yeah, it can be combined for meta-analysis as well. So using those frameworks really is also improving scientific research. It's not just a philosophical way of thinking about how to gain knowledge and what knowledge is, and to play around with those taxonomies and ontologies. It can be really used also for empirical research to increase the reliability and validity of your research results, and also for sharing data. And if we want to basically summarize or aggregate several people who want to share data, we could use a knowledge representation system called a knowledge graph, which is then basically a representation of not only the different entities, it's not only a definition system, but it also includes the data sets then the metadata model, like an ontology, is describing. So we now add real brain scans, for example, for Alzheimer's patients, and within the metadata of the data set, we link it with the mesh term Alzheimer's disease to know what the data is about. And basically we can formulate this equation that an ontology is just a scheme to describe data. And if you combine data and ontology, we have a knowledge graph, because we then can add different data sets, an EEG data set, an fMRI data set, and a data set of an animal model for Alzheimer's disease with the same concept. And because it's interlinked with the knowledge graph, we can access all the data sets via this concept. If we are interested in, for example, general dementias, which is a superclass of Alzheimer's disease, because Alzheimer's disease is a form of a dementia, we can also include other data sets that are based on other patients with other dementias. And you know where I want to go. So with this representation system, we can go up and down each layer to specify or broaden up our search and link our data sets, and retrieve the data we are really particularly interested in. And the better the metadata annotation for a data set is, the better we find it. So we can say that in knowledge graph, there are things annotated, not mere strings. So we have representation of information and knowledge about the real world object and the real world connections. So we have each object represented by a distinct and defined semantic entity, and we disambiguate those entities because, for example, words can have multiple meanings. So there's the Taj Mahal, the monument, and there's the musician Taj Mahal. And if you're interested in the weight of the Taj Mahal, for example, or in the height, it's pretty important that you know who you're talking about and which you're talking about. So yeah, this is a pretty basic example, but I think you know where to go with this. And yeah, I mean, this is also interesting. For example, if you have multiple Taj Mahals and you're aggregating like data points for like millions of measurements for the Taj Mahal, and you have you can't like go through each by bare hand. You can't evaluate it manually. But if you have like 3,000 measurements for the musician, it will bias your analysis result because you're aggregating this two different concepts, two different entities, data from two different entities that have the same name. And with this disambiguation, you remove the bias from your average measurement, basically. So to elaborate a bit further this example. Yes. Okay. There's the knowledge graphs in neuroscience, knowledge graphs for different applications. There are disease-specific knowledge graphs that, for example, use textual information, extract the texts, the entities from the text with controlled vocabularies, extract the data, use this then to associate different concepts with experimental data, with pathway interaction databases, or with other knowledge graphs, with patient-specific data, for example, to build a really big resource, a multi-data source resource that tries to aggregate the knowledge in a systematizing way. And this is one approach for our colleagues from the Fraunhofer Institute for Scientific Computing are using to have a text mining-based knowledge graph about disease mechanisms that include textual data like scientific publications, but also subject-specific data from personalized medicine to build up a knowledge graph of certain molecular cascades that are the cause of certain phenomena of certain pathologies. So one example is the NeuroMMSIG knowledge graph from the Fraunhofer Institute, which is basically a knowledge graph for neurodegenerative diseases, and it's using graphs for Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, but also epilepsy. And the aim is to have a mechanism-based nosology for different disease classification systems, and also a mechanism-based etiology for that is using systematized biological pathway knowledge and molecular cascades to describe the disease trajectories of a certain neurodegenerative disease. And as you can see here, there are different concepts for example, proteins, abundances, biological processes, genes, symptoms. So we can have multiple scales, knowledge from multiple scales integrate into this knowledge graph. And we have different namespaces, as you can see here on top, the gene nomenclature we showed you above, the gene ontology, biological processes, and the medical subject headings are also integrated. So if you're working with this kind of data sets and with this kind of technologies, you will come across those three ontologies frequently because they are the most prominent ones. And then, for example, this is encoded inside the knowledge graph. So the chemical compound amyloid beta decreases the calcium ion homeostasis, and this is then basically one triplet in a huge graph of the subject predicate object syntax. Then there's also more data-centered knowledge graphs in neuroscience. The eBrains knowledge graph, for example, it's basically a search engine for data sets. And in order to access the data you're interested in, each data set is annotated with a really rich metadata scheme. So we have the broad categories that this is a data set, this is a subject, this is a sample, this is a model, this is a software. And each data set can be then associated with a certain subject or a certain software or a certain contributor. So this is an interlinked graph. So you could basically select all the data sets from one specific contributor, for example, or all the data sets that are for a specific subject or for a specific species. And the more complex the metadata layer is, the more complex you can also search different data sets. For example, if you are interested in a specific mouse model for one specific disease that is monogenetic disease, then if the data is available in the knowledge graph, we can search for this particular combination of concepts. So we have semantic concepts in the knowledge graph, we have spatial concepts in the knowledge graph, and then we can have the concrete data. And we can access the eBrains knowledge graph, for example, with the Zebra Python package, which is just a wrapper for the API for the knowledge graph that has also those different layers. And the topmost layer is always the semantic concepts about different brain atlases, for example, different reference spaces, for example, different brain parcellations. If we're interested only in the visual cortex, you can select this as a semantic concepts, and then we get when we can get all the different spatial realizations, basically, of the visual cortex, so in different species, in different template spaces. And then we can look for the data that is associated with this spatial points that are linked to the semantic concept that this spatial point is actually the visual cortex. So if we have this, we can then extract like different regional data features, like receptor densities for the visual cortex, for example, or for all areas, gene expression, connectivity data, and other regional data sets in this knowledge graph. And this is only possible with a semantic metadata layer that selects only the applicable data sets that correspond to your query. So this is then basically all the information we now talk about in the rest of the talk in the next 20 minutes or 15 minutes. So databases, ontologies, and knowledge graphs and semantic metadata, those are all interconnected concepts. So a database stores basically structured data. An ontology defines the hierarchical relationships and categories within the data. And a knowledge graph connects and basically contextualizes the entities and their interrelations. And therefore, we can say, okay, the semantic metadata adds then meaningful context to the data, enhancing its interoperability and also its usefulness. Okay, so we have an improved data integration and more effective data analysis. So now we have the basics, and now I only have the time to rush through the rest. Sorry about that, but also I'm also always feeling that without the basics, then it's a lecture series and it's not a complete scientific talk. So we can also talk about this later in the end if you have still some questions. So there is the differentiation between the mechanistic models and phenomenological models in neuroscience. If you talk about computational models, so we have in the it's a spectrum. So we have a more realistic approach that integrates different expert knowledge. We have biological plausibility and the notion of validity. So we can say this mechanistic model is knowledge driven. And then we have a phenomenological model, which is a more pragmatic approach, which goes for the abstraction, the simplification to reproduce certain behaviors. And this also enables the prediction and also generalizability, but it's more data-driven. But we can say a computational model is never either or. So it's rarely uniquely mechanistic or phenomenological. It's both, but it's on the spectrum. And we can use different knowledge sources to input biological valid data into brain simulation. So what has been done before was, for example, to use neurotransmitter distributions. So we could use positron emission tomography to find the distribution of different neurotransmitter receptors, for example, or different released neurotransmitters in the brain. So we know which brain area releases the most neurotransmitters, for example. And then we can include this information into a whole brain model. And you heard already how this works in the first presentation. So we have different data sources to build up our model and our neural mass model, for example. And we can use regional biological data to, for example, for serotonin receptors here in this case, to adjust the influence of the neurotransmitter activity on this brain area, basically, because so this is done by Gustavo Deco from 2018. Sorry, this is not ancient work. It is 2018, and yeah, so he used empirical data about a certain concept to inform the gain modulation, so how a certain neurotransmitter, how the influence of a certain neurotransmitter acts upon this brain area, and the result was that the data, so the biological data, increased the model fit, and they used a model for the effects of LSD. And they compared the placebo group and an LSD group. They fitted the model to the placebo group and then used the neurotransmitter distribution to adjust the model. And they see that the functional connectivity fits for the LSD group was way better than if you shuffle the receptor map. So each area has to have its biologically valid neurotransmitter distribution in order to have a good model fit. So we say introducing, so basically the story is, or the message is, that if we introduce this regional heterogeneity, so our biological plausible data into our brain model, we get better fits of a certain phenomenon. This was also then done with other kinds of modalities. So it's also a group from Gustavo Deco around him, who included now different modalities. For example, the myelination content of the cortex, for example, or the principal component of the gene expression in based on the Allen Human Brain Atlas, or excitatory inhibition map, for example. And end of the story is always that introducing heterogeneity impacts brain dynamics. So if we know that different concepts are distributed across the brain, and we know that this impacts the brain dynamics. And we can also see that using biologically plausible knowledge about the distribution of brain areas, the fits are increased. So this is a static functional connectivity as a fitting target, and using the heterogeneous maps is always superior to the homogeneous maps. And also, if you have a more dynamical connectivity fit, we have also better correlations. So introducing this knowledge makes sense, but those are just studies that are just trying to explore the effect of the heterogeneity, and using simple modalities like one map of the difference of the ratio between the T1 weighted image and T2 weighted image as myelination, as a proxy for myelination. But there are different sources of regional heterogeneity that are also interconnected, and we have to account for all of them basically in a real big model, or we take a look at each one separately. But just I will just show you this because there's a lot more to explore. So there's a lot more to see. So we have different cellular compositions, we have different molecular expressions, so gene expressions, we have different connectivity patterns, we have maps for structural or functional specialization. So for example, this down here is a map for executive functioning, so where in the brain this is associated with. We have developmental trajectories of, this is a trajectory of functional connectivity. So we see that the brain rewires, or basically the areas that talk to each other change during development, from early childhood to old age. We have pathological changes, for example, here, I think cortical thinning in a certain form of dementia. And we have environmental factors also influencing different brain areas. So this is basically a map of the associations of psychological stress. So the limbic cortex is associated with psychological stress and emotion, or the amygdala, for example. You know this, that there are different areas of the brain. And how we could use this then is we use these regional maps of those heterogeneity, sources of heterogeneity, and incorporate this in the virtual brain. And we've seen it in one example that the receptor distribution map was influencing the synaptic gain of the serotonin receptors on the activity of other neurotransmitters. This is one implementation of including knowledge about the distribution of neurotransmitters into an individual brain model. But there are so many different sources and so many different ways of implementing. Therefore, we need a more systematized approach. We need a more, we cannot do this for each manually. This will take ages. And therefore, we now in the last 10 minutes show you some work that we've done. For example, that we've done within the approach of integrating biological models within cause and effect chains into brain simulation models. And therefore we use biological pathways, disease-specific knowledge, and anatomical knowledge, which is mostly derived from biomedical literature. And so we have data, we talked about the eBrain's knowledge graph already, we have knowledge and mathematics, and in order to connect data with knowledge and mathematics with knowledge and data, we built some structures of implementing those biological pathways. We've talked about this before. So this is a image of the NeuroMMSIG knowledge graph. So we have anatomical, we have biomedical concepts, and their interrelation. So we know that this gene produces this reaction, and this reaction is then associated with cortical thinning, for example. And so we can really trace down the activity paths of those molecules towards the phenotype or the synonym, but we do not know the anatomical representation. There's what I want to get to. So we have, for example, this is a subgraph of neuroamylase IgG showing the amyloidogenesis. So how the amyloid beta plaques are generated in Alzheimer's disease, or how they are influencing different symptoms. And so you see here different compounds, so genes, biological processes. And what we've now done is, for each process and concept, we derived a brain map of the associations of the concept with certain brain areas, because we need this regional heterogeneity for adding biological knowledge in a plausible way, because we know that each brain area is affected differently from a certain concept. So why we want to do this? We know this. Where we want to do this, we can map this with the tool I will show you with TVBase. And how we can do this, the question is now, is the integration on the link with an ontology. So this is also, Leon showed you in the talk before, so I will quickly go over this. We built a tool that maps those concepts, defined ontologies, onto the brain using a literature mining framework, also from our colleagues from the Fraunhofer Institute, which is basically a richly annotated literature database, which is based on 36 million publications. And there you can search for certain concepts from our medical subject headings. So we get all the publications that are somehow linked to the concept of Alzheimer's disease, no matter how it's described, basically also in different languages. And we can extract now the anatomical terms defined in the Uberon ontology. So we know each publication, and we know for each publication how many and which Uberon terms have been used, because every publication is already analyzed using literature mining and named entity recognition systems. So now we can project basically all the information extracted with literature mining to the brain. And we're using a measure from information science. This is called Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is basically comparing two distributions, two probability distributions. And by that, we can assess how strong a certain brain area is associated with a certain concept from the literature. So we have a basic overview of, or a basic mapping framework from anatomical terms to different voxels of the brain, and we can now project associations that can be derived from literature mining onto the brain surface, basically, on also the volumetric structure of the brain. Because Leon told you already some things about this, I will not go into detail, but if you're interested in it, please ask a question. So we have a detailed anatomical documentation that basically projects the semantic information about brain anatomy back to the 3D coordinate space. With this, we can map all the concepts defined in biomedical ontologies. And I can show you here some different modalities, and we try to compare basically the semantic mapping process with our tool TVBase with empirical data. And here you can see in the top row for the power distribution for MEG data. So this is the spatial distribution of frequency, the frequency power for example, the alpha frequency band, the beta frequency, the delta frequency, the theta frequency. And in the bottom row, you can see the maps that we created using literature mining and the semantic web technology TVBase we've been creating. And you can see here by bare eye the great resemblance of the different the empirical data and the data extracted from the literature, because there are so many publications out there that describe the visual cortex and the alpha frequency together. So they associate basically this anatomical area semantically with a certain concept of brain activity, for example, alpha frequency. And this can be read out using those controlled vocabularies and using this semantic web approach and mapped to the brain. And we can see, for example, that there are also differences, because this is MEG data. This is average MEG data from the Human Connectome project. And this is literature mining based brain maps. And we can see here that our brain map associates the hippocampus as the most relevant area for the theta frequency band. But we cannot see this here because this is a mere cortical representation and doesn't include the hippocampus. And therefore, this information is not entailed in this data set. But we can read it out with our literature mining platform. Same goes for different receptor PET maps. So we have here also positron emission tomography maps for different neurotransmitter receptors. And with our literature mining approach, TVBase, we can map those neurotransmitter receptors with high similarity to the empirical data. But we can also map metabolic or microstructural features of brain structure, for example, myelination or glucose metabolism, for example, blood flow and blood volume. So we can really use those semantic web technologies. We can use a systematized knowledge framework to extract the knowledge that we are interested in. And we can get a precise report of all the information we can extract. And this is only possible to use it with predefined concepts that link the data points with each other. And then we can analyze also our data set, but I will also jump this because it's already a lot of time that has passed. All right, so but we can see that I would just show you this quickly. So we can see that we can derive literature networks that share the organizational traits with brain structure and brain function. So we can see here that we can derive a network of relevance. So how the brain areas are described together. So how the brain areas are associated across a set of multiple concepts. And this resembles also functional connectivity and structural connectivity derived from empirical data. Therefore, we can really not only systematize knowledge, but also analyze this knowledge and see that we have also entailed empirical features in a high abstract form. And with reading papers, we might not get this quantitative result. So this is a systematized, aggregated way of analyzing already existing knowledge about the brain that has been written down in scientific publications. So we've been using this also to decode basically spatial patterns. And we've done this for Alzheimer's disease patients. And yeah, sorry that this is also a bit quick, but we talked about this already in other talks. So you can look into our YouTube channel and see this in detail. Yeah, but we can say that if we map Alzheimer's disease symptoms, we can predict the cognitive decline based on the decoding of amyloid beta maps, of amyloid beta positron emission tomography data from the individual subject. This is also a Python package we've written. Okay, so so I will just show you this slide because it's been already 90 minutes. We can also use this then this information about where in the brain things are happening, together with a tool that also we've developed, the virtual brain ontology, to formulate all the compounds of a brain network model and to semantically define all the different compounds, for example, the neural mass model, the local connectivity, the global connectivity or external input, the external perturbation of the system. These are all concepts of brain network modeling. And basically, we represented this in our semantic web technology and an ontology to formulate basically those triplets. The global coupling is required for simulation, for example. That J is a parameter of the Janssen-Ritt model, for example. That alpha 1 is an argument of the sigmoid function of the Janssen-Ritt model. Or we also integrated biological knowledge. So we can say that the parameter B of the Janssen-Ritt model is a surrogate of inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, for example. And by that, we can really formalize the knowledge about brain simulations and integrate this with all the information we can retrieve that are out there already annotated with semantic metadata. We can integrate now the maps we created with our tool TVBase, and we can integrate other biological parameters with the biological mechanisms, for example, the gene ontology. So this looks like this is then a graph representation of the TVB ontology. So we have all the neural mass models available inside TVB, all the neural mass model parameters, and all are interlinked with different relational properties. So those are the properties, for example. So just to show you that we are also have a controlled vocabulary. So we are including acronyms, synonyms. So because different parameters have different nomenclatures and different studies. And it's always hard to talk about certain parameters of an equation because people are using different parameter nomenclatures. So we also define this to systematize this. Yes, this is how it looks like. And this is how the graph-based representation basically of one neural mass model looks like. So we have the information that is from publications and the equations, mathematical on the left. And we have the semantic and the semantic embedding of the concepts basically in a graph-based fashion. As you can see here, that R is a parameter of the sigmoid function, B is a parameter of the derivative of Y5 and something like that. So we have a semantic embedding of all the concepts of TVB. I will jump this, but yes, so we can now have also we can now store also different model configurations from different studies, because we can integrate this in our graph-based network. We can say that this parameter has this value in this publication because everything is interlinked. And we can say that this combination of parameters is associated with a certain frequency, for example, the alpha frequency. And you see how how the circle closes, because we can also have the empirical data that is associated with alpha frequency mapped. And therefore, we have always the interlinking between concepts from different domains. And using this information, we can now reproduce basically findings from original studies. Using the information from TVBO, we can say now we use the configuration from Janssen-Ritt, and then use this which is associated with the alpha frequency. And yeah, on the left-hand side, you can see the original drawing from Janssen and Ritt from the 1995 paper. And on the right-hand side, you can see the simulation that is generated with our ontology. So it's a pretty nice resemblance of the original data. For sure, there's some certain noise properties we cannot recreate because we don't know which kind of the exact characteristics of the noise, but basically we can have the same parameter configurations, get the same temporal characteristics. And with that, we can have data provenance. And we can have all the parts of our simulation defined in a graph-based fashion, and all the parts are of a data output are linked to a semantic metadata entity. And therefore, we know for each data where it comes from. And we know from each data point what has been done to the data, how the data was processed, with which combination of parameters our time series of our simulated time series was generated, and to which agent it was attributed to. And with that, we have also, again, a decentralized way of keeping track of data provenance, because we just have in our simulation output now the identifier of the model that has been used. And the model is then defined in the ontology. And therefore, we don't have to store all the definitions and everything in the metadata output, which then inflates. We can always have an interlinked set of definitions and data that is not only good for integrating like data sets, but also for interpreting data sets we get. And therefore, this is a model of how to use semantic web technologies, how to use the knowledge that we have about certain processes to make sense of data. So yeah, you can see here the simulation used a certain set of connectivity, local connectivity of global connectivity, which was based on brain parcellation, reconstruction, surface reconstruction algorithms, or tractography algorithm, which was used with a specific software, specific agent. And we can see that our simulation output produces physiological time series data, which was generated by a certain forward model, certain monitor that used a particular time series that was generated by a particular set of simulation parameters. So yeah, this is then entailed in the data output. And if we have a semantic description of this provenance graph, we always know where the data comes from. Yeah. Just to show you a nice picture, we can use this then also to also compare different neural mass models, because we have the information about biophysical properties of different parameters. We can explore parameters with similar biophysical properties to get similar characteristics in two completely different models. So for example, here we compared the Jensen-Ritt model, which is a oscillatory model, so we can have oscillations, with the reduced Wang-Wang model, which is not an oscillatory model, which is also has less dimensions and less complexities, as you can see here with the bifurcation diagrams. But we can explore basically the effect of certain parameters, which can be seen as excitability parameters, how a system responds to the same set of inputs with different settings of the parameter that links to the excitability. And this is already all automated with TVBO, because we know that those parameters have equivalent or similar, at least, biophysical characteristics. And then we can produce similar simulation outputs. So you can see here a simulation output. If we stimulate one area, then or perturbate this area, then we have an oscillation, but the stimulation is not enough to excite the system. And with a higher excitability or input parameter, we can bring the system into another state, and in this oscillatory state, so we can excite the system with the same input and the same external input, the same stimulation. And the same goes for the reduced Wang-Wang model. We can excite the system, or we can have an overexcited system where the stimulation don't changes the state or the regime of the dynamical system. So this is a way of using the semantic knowledge to also really dive into brain simulation and to access the knowledge about certain parameters and to compare it. Yes. And on the top, you can see the graph-based representation of the different parameters and how they influence each other, and if they are excitatory or inhibitory. And you can see the clustering of the inhibitory populations and the excitatory populations, because they are mathematically more related to each other. And you can see also the degrees, so basically the amount of connections of the different parameters inside the models. So you can use this kind of graph-based information representation to also gain knowledge in order to have another perspective. Okay, so I will close this up so we can do a lot of it with it. So I will just close this. Sorry for all the time, but we can use this now, this knowledge, where in the brain certain processes happen, and how to map those processes with certain parameters to use this for brain simulation. And we showed here in a replication study of the work from Leon Stefanowski, he was talking about this last week. Therefore, I will show you this without going into detail again. Sorry. But we can reproduce basically the simulation. Yeah, here you find the talk. But you can reproduce the characteristic of slowing in frequency if you use the map based on semantic literature mining. This is here shown here, the slowing in dominant frequency, and this is the empirical data. So we can approximate the empirical data features with the semantic knowledge we can access using those semantic web technologies. And with that, I want to close the ontologic loop and say thank you for keeping up with me. And yeah, if there are 5 minutes, then we can have some short rounds of questions. But otherwise, I will show you the references for the recording and say also thank you for the other colleagues from our lab, because the developments of those tools, of course, are based on many other people. So yeah, thanks for keeping up with me, and yeah.